take the big and important problems before the legislators, city councils, before voters, and boil them down to numbers, to impact, to concrete facts that Coloradans can internalize and weigh, even as they make up their own minds. I'm proud to say that this approach has even won respect from CSI from across political spectrums. Recently, for example, Governor Polis said the following about CSI: "I generally really like their work." We'll take the compliment. Simply stated, we believe policy discussions shouldn't be based on talking points and dueling tweets. They should be based on facts, numbers, and thoughtful analysis. From the public option to energy to education, and the emphasis on facts we bring to it. Before we get to the program, I'd like to introduce CSI's board of directors. If you could all please stand and be recognized. And I know we have board members here, so thank you. Our board is comprised of some remarkable individuals. They're bright, committed to the facts, and they care about making our state better. It's an honor to work alongside of them every day. I'd also like to thank our Leaders Circle, Economic Roundtable members, and Free Enterprise Champion members in the room. We value your membership, and without your generous support, we would not be able to conduct the research that we do. Also, if you're interested in becoming a member, find me later. Lastly, I want to thank Amazon, our event program sponsor. A special thanks to Brittany, who's here today, for recognizing our work and developing this partnership. I also want to share some groundbreaking news on Amazon that I read this week. They just announced an additional 125,000 local employment opportunities throughout the US, which includes 2,700 new jobs in Denver and another 2,200 in Colorado Springs. Thank you, Amazon. So you'll find on your tables, for those of you on Zoom, we'll put it in the chat, but the 2021 November elections, it's hard to believe, are less than 2 months away. Colorado Blue Books will be arriving in your mailbox the upcoming weeks. Common Sense Institute this week was excited to release our 2021 ballot guide, where you'll find important analysis on some measures that you'll face and vote for. I want to give a special shout out to the team, the CSI team, who worked tirelessly to make sure that this ballot guide was done way in advance of voters receiving their ballots. Megan, Alexa, Chris, Whitney, Eric, thank you. You did great. And so today we'll be talking about 4 of those issues. Proposition 119, the Learning Enrichment and Academic Progress Program, known as LEAP. Proposition 120, reduce property tax assessment rates. And then a few city and county of Denver measures. Initiated ordinance 303, let's do better. Referred question 2B, Denver sheltering systems bonds. Initiated ordinance 304, net taxes already. Momentarily, I'll be in conversation, but everybody's mom told Rude to have their phone at an event. Moment. Earl's rolling his eyes. Take out your cell phone. For those of you who are virtual, you can play along too. Throughout the program, I you and free to share your thoughts on what you hear. If you like it, follow us, please do. We're on all of them. Subscribe to our podcast, which we have. But well, this stage, right. And we recently had some groundbreaking news. We just passed over 500 downloads on an episode, so we have a little something for you. Yeah, to add to your collection of trophies and hopefully convince a few people to also download the podcast. So, yeah. Okay, so let's get to the program. I'd like to introduce and invite our other panelists up to this stage at this moment. Michael Fields, where's Michael? Oh, good. Oh, here, good. Michael is the Executive Director of Colorado Rising Action. And he was previously the Senior Director of Issue Education for AFP, State Director of AFP Colorado. He's a Fox 31 Denver political analyst, as well an adjunct professor of American politics. Michael is the main proponent of Initiative 120, Property Tax Assessment Rate Reduction. Welcome, Michael. Tony Lewis. For 20 years, Tony Lewis led the Donald K. Foundation. Their work in policy, practice, and innovative pilots and prototypes have positioned the foundation as a thought leader in reimagining the educational system of the state and in specific policies and practices that have led to direct improvement of the lives of students, families, and educators. And Tony has been instrumental in leading the Initiative 119 LEAP. Thank you, Tony, for joining us. Gazette in Colorado politics. He covers the federal and state appellate courts in Colorado, including appeals of ballot titles at the state Supreme Court. Thank you, Michael, for joining us. Lastly, but not least, welcome to the stage CSI's Chris Brown, who serves as our Vice President of Policy and Research with the Common Sense Institute, where he leads all of our research efforts and to provide insightful, accurate, actionable information on the implications of public policy issues throughout the state. Thanks, Chris, for joining us. With that, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I was mentioning to somebody earlier that Colorado is, I don't know if it's unique, but we certainly have opportunities a lot of other states don't have. Think about an off election year where we have some really key important issues during an off election year. I mean, this is really an off election year. And yet we're going to be talking about education for the state. We're going to be talking about something that hopefully will help us kind of narrow that educational inequality that's out there in the state. With regards to kids not having a chance to have learning, going back with regards to English proficiency, reading proficiency, falling back math proficiency. But Tony, let's get started. So how we're going to uniquely, I think, try to handle this issue with Proposition 1. The Learning Enrichment Act. What's its purpose?
Thanks. And can you all hear me out there? Is this working? Great.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you for having me. And we're really excited about the LEAP program, in part because we think it can close the achievement gap, but more than that, it can close what we call the opportunity gap. Let me tell you a little bit about the measure before we talk about the revenue source. So the measure essentially raises money, and we'll go into that, to distribute to low-income families. And that's key, right? Under 100% federal poverty level, fill that bucket, and then you can go up to the 200% federal poverty level. But we're aiming to serve low-income families and kids with this money. It provides them the opportunity to select a provider of their choice for any kind of experience that is out of school, not in school, right? So think back to all the things you did as a kid that made you who you are. Think of all the things you provide your kids to make them who they are, from soccer camps to tutoring, to driver's ed, to test prep. All those things are out of school, and all of those things require resources. And if you don't have the resources, you can't provide your kid with those things that we know are critical to their development. Chris did a great analysis, he and CSI team, around how much this would help kids, especially academically. So when you think about tutoring, if you're going to ever keep up and you get behind, you're going to need a tutor. We do that automatically with our kids. If you don't have the money, you can't get the tutor. This would serve about 94,600 students in this state, low-income students with tutoring. And we're talking in the state between grades 4 and 8, 73% of kids are not proficient in math. Think about that. 73% of kids in Colorado are not proficient in math. Schools alone can't close that gap. There has to be something else. And we frankly believe that parents know their kids best. They know what they need and should direct these funds to those activities that will help them the most.
Tony, thanks. I appreciate it. Chris, this isn't free. And so how do we all of a sudden get the money to do what Tony's talking about?
Yeah, so this is funded primarily through a statewide tax increase on recreational marijuana. So it would raise the statewide tax rate from 15% to 20% at full implementation, raise about $137 million is the estimate by year 3. There's an additional $20 million transfer from the general fund from existing revenues that come from the state land trust funds and revenue source. So to kind of give some perspective, we looked at that tax in a couple different ways, but with the passage of Proposition EE last year, which changed taxation around cigarettes and tobacco products, vaping products will have a tax rate of about 62% by 2027. Cigarettes will have an effective tax rate of 36%. Again, this is statewide. So recreational marijuana at 20% will be less than cigarettes and vaping products. It'll be the second highest recreational marijuana tax on a base rate in the country behind Washington State. So kind of hard to get your bearings exactly where this falls, but give you a sense of kind of the relative scale of this tax compared to maybe some of the other, sin taxes, if you will.
Okay. Tony, I want to go back to you. You mentioned the learning loss during the pandemic to some extent. Reframe that for us again. The pandemic occurred, and what happened in Colorado, and pinpoint, if you would please, how you hope that this LEAP and the funds will be used and how the parents will take advantage of it.
Sure. With the pandemic, there was no consistency of what happened across the state, right? Which is some of the cause of many of our problems as parents and for our kids. Some schools were mass, some schools went remote. It was every kid and every parent for themselves. And because of that, there was such unequal learning going on during the pandemic. Some kids did okay because guess what? Their parents hired tutors and they supplemented their learning. Now, if you're a low-income family, you have 2 jobs, and you're spending most of your time driving between jobs and trying to get things ready. When you have a kid mandated to be at home because the school's not open and they need to be online, and your internet is sketchy at best, how does your child learn? And how do you not go to work to supervise your child who is at home? It's impossible. So estimates are, and there's no great data, estimates are on average, kids lost at least 6% of learning from prior years. So to make that up, and frankly, for ongoing academic loss, we need something more than just schools.
You said something I think is rather important for all of us to understand. So we're not only trying to make up something, But you're saying this is ongoing. So
Absolutely.
we would have ongoing funding that is parents, particularly as you've described, I'm going to get to you, Chris, in a second, and the numbers. But the parents that said, hey, my child is having difficulty with math and it just isn't getting it in the classroom, that parent, if they want, 2 years from now or 3 years from now, can go get a tutor and find somebody that can communicate with that child to help them better understand math or whatever and get to the proficiency level they need to advance in school.
Absolutely.
Now, can this program be in the school as well as outside of the school?
It could be offered after school or out of school. And schools are large providers of these services, especially in our rural areas, right? This is a
So
statewide
my
program.
school, my local public school, if they want, can say, hey, we're going to have this special program. And the teachers that are there or others can come in and provide the support.
That's correct.
And they can tell the parent, hey, this program is available. So the parent doesn't have to necessarily be the only one to take initiative. Is that fair?
That is fair.
Oh, Chris, what are we talking about in the way of kids that are likely to, or children that are likely to be benefited by this? That, you know, I don't know, what do we have in the way of 250,000 kids that are in the, what, 4th through 8th program? They've got difficulties here in the state. What's the number?
Yeah, well, I think Tony, hit on some of those, and just to reiterate, what's interesting to me about this program, and we evaluated the impacts, there's both the immediate near-term impacts and the benefits to students directly related to the learning loss or the COVID slide. And, as Tony pointed out, the testing this year was a little spotty. It didn't, cover all grades and all, sort of curriculum, but as Tony said, about 73% of 3rd through 8th grade students did not meet expectations in math. That was a 6 percentage point increase from the prior year. So again, we don't have across the entire K-12 system, but that 6%, if you were to assume the 6% increase in those that are not meeting expectation was attributed to the pandemic, the learning loss from the last 18 months, that's more than 55,000 Colorado students if you equate that across the entire K-12 system.
Okay.
So as Tony pointed out, if you assume students obtain the full $1,500 benefit, we could reach 12% of students or 95,000 kids. If that average is $500, so students only use on average $500 of benefit, you could reach 35% of students across the state. So far beyond those may be directly impacted and directly experience some learning loss through the pandemic. And again, this is ongoing. So it's a large amount of money that can reach students probably well beyond just the 150% of federal poverty level, and have a real impact. So
Christian, I want to challenge you in CSI. It seems to me that there's a return metric here, that if we know the kids aren't at proficiency level in 4th grade, there's a high likelihood that don't graduate from high school. That's a significant economic impact. So it seems to me, Chris, that maybe you can do some math here, buddy, and share with folks that, hey, if we can increase the level of proficiency, we can increase the level of graduation. We increase the level of graduation, we have an economic impact for the state. So this might be a bargain. I'm looking at a venture capitalist out there, Steve Halstead, and Steve would say, if I can get a 5-to-1 return on a venture capital deal, that's pretty good investment. I'll lay odds you can get that kind of return. What do you think?
I'm just glad you tasked Kristen for that task.
Well, let's move on. Property tax question. Michael, you have been involved in this issue, and God love you, man, for understanding it from Gallagher to this. In Proposition 120, the property tax assessment rate deduction, what is that all about? Help us out.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It's good to be here with you, Earl. I hope I didn't scare off any of these elected officials from attending today. But I think the biggest thing is everybody saw the property tax assessment that they got this year, right? And it went up, and most of the state, it went up huge margins that we'll have to start paying taxes on next year. And so we thought this was a good time coming off the pandemic, coming off a time when government has more money than ever, to say we need a 9% cut to both the residential and non-residential property taxes. And if you think about it on the commercial side, right, we've had Gallagher in place for 40 years up until last year, and businesses have not had an opportunity to lower their assessment rate at all during that time. And so we're just not competitive. We're not competitive with our surrounding states. You look at Utah, our property taxes on the commercial side are twice as high, Wyoming 3 times as high. But then on the residential side, and you see the pressure if you talk to people, you know, it's nice when your house goes up in value and every 6 years it doubles. But if you want to stay in that house and you're on a fixed income, or you're a senior, or somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck, that increase in property taxes that we're seeing is a huge burden on you. And so we thought this is a good time to make that cut, but then also know that this is only the first step, right? That we still need to cap how much property taxes can go up. We need to lower the commercial rate even more. And we need to have a regional approach, right? Property doesn't go up the same amount in every part of the state. Western Slope, Eastern Plains don't have that same kind of value that goes up as the metro area. And so this is kind of a first step. We need to lower that amount. Then let's work on those reforms afterwards, knowing that government, you know, the stuff that the legislature does, increasing mills, everything, you know, and think about the stimulus money that just came in, right? This is money that's going to last 3 or 4 years. $12 billion came into state and local government right now.
What is that, a percent of the budget?
Well, our budget is 34 billion, but you look at
So it's about
how much
a
of that,
third.
about half of that's going to the state, half of it's going to localities.
Okay. So
But
it's
government
about
has a lot of money right now.
Okay.
So
So you're saying, let's just get something in balance. Mike O'Garlick, you work down at the State House and follow things, and you're aware of the chicanery that could go on down there, right?
Never.
Never. And as I understand it, Senate Bill 293 was kind of, they heard about Michael and what Michael was trying to do, and they decided, hey, we have an answer. Kind of explain what's going on, will you?
So Senate Bill 293 was a piece of legislation with bipartisan sponsorship to modify the very section of law that Proposition 120 also seeks to modify. Under the
So
Senate.
as a counterbalance, the decrease in property tax assessment.
Sure, so that's the effect of it. The Senate bill takes the 2 categories of property, residential, non-residential, broke it into further categories, and then it had the effect of changing the properties to which Proposition 120 applies. Instead of all properties, residential and non-residential, now this ballot initiative applies only to multifamily, residential, and then lodging on the commercial side. So while Prop 120 would have had a $1 billion decrease in revenues to local government, now that impact is a $50 million decrease in revenues, again, compared to $1 billion.
5% of what they.
I'm not good at math, so I'll take your word for it,
Okay,
Earl.
all right. No, you're only a University of Virginia grad, so I wouldn't expect anything different.
Sure. But Senate Bill 293 itself does give a temporary reduction in rates to those other categories that it created. So the net effect is about a $250 million decrease in the short term, and then a permanent $50 million decrease thanks to the proposition.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. Chris, so we have this proposition that had a very broad appeal. Now it's been narrowed down by the Senate bill. What are we talking about with regards to the overall, property tax, the outcome, the differences? You described it to some extent. What's our assessment?
Yeah, well, we try to, deliver concise information and give people some clear sense of what the outcome might be. But in this case, we had to offer 2 scenarios about what the potential revenue impacts would be. And as Michael said, the revenue impact is $1 billion difference, depending on how Senate Bill 293 ultimately plays out and whether or not, due to the fact that the initiative was submitted prior to the legislation, if that law actually remains. And again, I'm not the lawyer, so I won't try to litigate that here.
Is there a chance? Is it being challenged?
I think you may
Michael?
have to, yeah.
Michael, is it
turn
being
that in
challenged?
yeah, we'll challenge it.
You're going to challenge it. And, in light of, well, besides paying an attorney who says you can win, what are the chances?
Yeah, I mean, I look, it's the courts, it's a political issue, and so you never know what's going to happen. I think 2 quick points on it. One is the Constitution says that you can't alter a ballot issue, right? So the ballot language is what is controlling. The ballot language says this is $1 billion tax cut. And anytime you're saying, well, a yes really means you're in trouble, right? When the legislature starts doing that. Second thing is that our ballot issue will pass after the legislature passed their bill. And so there's a principle in any kind of statute.
He's an attorney, so we have to, okay.
Basically, if something is passed after something else, that is what's controlling, right? And so they're trying to jump ahead, take away the vote of the people on this. What actually happens in the courts, I don't know. But the way I look at this is we need to win this thing big this year, and then we can do the legal fight. And if we lose the legal fight, we'll come back with something else that can address this. And so if the people want something, they're going to get it eventually. And I think we're at a point where they do, but I like our legal chances.
Okay, so what your argument is that regardless of whether it's $1 billion or it's 50 million, the point is we've got to win big. Let the people, the populace has got to say, what do we really want here? If you have that momentum, then you have the encouragement to go legally into the courts to try to win. If you don't win in the courts, then you go back and try to change the statute. Am I fair on that?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think the main point is that the constitutionality of this saying, legislature can't come in and say, you know what, we're going to change your ballot issue so that we all get, just legislators get property tax. A yes vote for everybody means that we actually get this, right? So think about it's not about property taxes. Think about this, a criminal law or anything. If we can change definitions, right, and make an outcome be different than what is said on the actual ballot language, that creates a problem. And that's what we're going to argue.
Earl, if I may jump in real quick.
Please.
So it's very rare that the Colorado Supreme Court will declare a law unconstitutional, and actions of the legislature are presumed to be constitutional. The standard for invalidating a law is beyond a reasonable doubt that it's unconstitutional. So that's a very high barrier. This might be a novel test case to see what the court does, but I think it's safer to say right now that the question is what happens to Proposition 120 given the current law, rather than what happens with Proposition 120 and Senate Bill 293 if both of them are up in the air right now.
Would you agree, Michael, that, but I know you're the objective down the middle report here, but would you agree that if there's an overwhelming passage of 120, that is in essence kind of an indication of what the populace wants, and that strong momentum to come back for another referendum that would change the statute?
If you're asking whether a favorable vote in the 55-60% margin this time around would give credence to a ballot initiative in, say, 2023,
yes,
to try to enact this a second time around, I think you could make that argument. Yes, I don't think the Supreme Court justices will necessarily look at that in their evaluation, but they're not immune to considering popular opinion.
Okay, got it. Hey, there has been COVID funds, and everybody is aware of it, and you've had monies for COVID-19 relief funding for municipalities, school districts, counties. How does that impact this proposition and the work we've done, Chris?
Yeah, and I guess I just want to, make another point on the revenue side that I think is important to understand here. This is a decreasing assessment rate, and within the property tax formula, you have the property itself, the assessment rate, and the individual mill levy applied by each taxing district. So we're talking revenue numbers here that are contingent upon a lot of different things holding constant or not moving, particularly on the mill levy side. So it could be the case that in some jurisdictions that do see net revenue decrease could raise those mill levies, or would see those mill levies increase, and there would be no revenue effect whatsoever. On the other hand, as you have seen in maybe your own property tax assessment, as Michael has pointed out, that property values have gone up significantly faster as well.
Range, 15 to 20% over a year's time.
Certainly. So where this will net out for each individual, especially if they're voting, expecting this to apply to single family homes, and then it doesn't, it's a very interesting potential. But to your question, there's about $4.5 billion in local government revenue that has come from the various federal relief packages to both local governments, city, county, as well. That includes about $2.5 billion, thanks to Brenda's investigative work, about $2.5 billion to schools directly. So the large beneficiaries of the local property tax at the same time are seeing again, more than $4.5 billion in revenue that will be spent or be allocated or ability to be able to be spent over the next 4 years. So as this change in assessment rate is playing out and having some potential revenue impacts, there is a large amount of funds, significantly larger than the revenue reductions we're talking about, that are being dispersed from the federal COVID relief packages.
Wow, is it 4.5 billion?
4.5 billion.
Local county governments?
And schools.
Well, that's found money. Well, let's go back to the local if we could, or let's go to the local at the present time. Michael, the statewide ballot initiatives, they're interesting, and there's not quite as many of them as we've had in the past. Well, we've got something kind of interesting going on here in Denver itself, and that has to do with what we would call the ordinance, ordinance 304, no, not 304, ordinance 303. Explain to us what that's all about, and what are we trying to accomplish with that?
Is that the We Can Do Better initiative?
That's correct.
Okay, so my understanding is that it has to do with the proliferation for people experiencing have been Denver since the pandemic started. Proposition or Ordinance 303 would clarify that people cannot camp on someone's private property without written permission, and then it would sanction 4 locations on public property where the city would have to provide.
Now, wait a minute. It sounds to me all you're trying to do is enforce the law that's already in place.
As well as clarify what can be done on public property.
Got it.
Which gives a responsibility to provide services and amenities to people at those sanctioned sites. Where it gets a little bit more extreme than just the surface is it gives a private right of action to people to sue the city to enforce that law. And in my reading, it could apply to enforcing the private property provision or the public property provision. I'm not entirely clear, but that could lead to a proliferation of lawsuits, and I'm not quite sure that would be something. It's certainly not something the city would want to be on the receiving end of, but I could see how it could get out of hand pretty quickly.
Well, I know a lot of us have been wondering what is the answer, and it seems to me Ordinance 303 is not only let's enforce what we already have as an ordinance or law, but it also is saying let's find encampments, and let's make certain if we can to find encampments replacing these folks. So it's not only let's enforce it, but also let's find encampments that have got sanitary conditions, that have got facilities that people in essence aren't going to be just not being able to take baths or take care of themselves. So there's a little bit more than just, hey, let's kick them off the streets. Would you agree?
I would, but again, with the private right of action, say someone is pitching a tent over the weekend in a parking lot of a commercial building. You could question who that's really.
Just casually pitching a tent, like my kids will go out and pitch a tent. Are you talking about that?
Sure, they've been told to move away from a residential area where they were on the sidewalk, and so they go to what they might think is the least intrusive environment possible. Does that private right of action give someone who's just walking by the ability to sue the city for letting that person camp on private property when they don't have written permission? I don't know, but that's the kind of question that I have personally about this ordinance.
My God, you sound like a reporter.
I'll take that as an insult.
No, I'll take that as a compliment, please. Ordinance 304. We're talking about saying, hey, wait a minute. Taxes just seem to be going up 25 basis points every election. And all of a sudden, a group of people are coming back to say, guess what? No more of that. In fact, we're going to reduce the sales tax level in Denver. What's going on, Chris? And what's the impact?
Yeah, so this is another Denver ordinance, which I think it's Enough Taxes Already is the name of this one, which would permanently cap the city sales tax at 4.5%, the all-inclusive local sales tax rate, which is currently 4.81%. And as you pointed out, since 2018, there have been 6 different incremental sales tax increases approved by voters, voted in by Denver voters, that have again, increased the sales tax rate from about 3.6 to now where it is 4.81%. So this is an attempt to say, let's cap that rate. And so in the near term, it has an immediate revenue impact. Again, estimate of around $70 million reduction against projections.
And how much is that a part of the Denver budget?
It's a good question. I don't know what it is as a percent of the overall budget.
Significant.
It's about 3% of the sales tax revenue. So,
Okay.
you know, when you consider local property tax, it's probably even smaller than that.
Okay.
Probably significantly smaller than that. So it's a question in the near term of this drop in the sales tax rate, which has some immediate revenue implications. As we talked about earlier with the statewide level, there's $4.5 billion. I just saw another estimate yesterday in the city's budget, or 2 days ago in the city's budget, that the city itself has received more than $300 million from American Rescue Plan, and that does not include CARES Act and some of the other authorizations. So again, there's a federal funding question that's significantly higher than what this potential revenue cut is. And
so this isn't something where all of a sudden we see massive cuts across the budget because they don't have this, you know, 30 basis points or 0.3% of additional taxes. There's all sorts of other funds there that could more than supplement that. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, and the 4.5% rate would be higher than the city sales tax rate was in 2020.
Okay.
So it's still higher than it was just a year ago, but it ratchets down. In the long term, the implication, I think, of the long term is that it requires any future vote of Denver residents that approve a potential sales tax increase that doesn't necessarily specify some other way to maintain under that 4.5% cap. It would allow the city council to go in and adjust the sales tax rate downward across maybe one of those other incremental areas, maybe to the base, to stay under that 4.5% cap. So there's some uncertainty in the future if residents were ever to use the sales tax as a way to fund other priorities, how that would play out. But there's a very immediate revenue impact, and then that longer term question I think lingers somewhat.
Okay, Michael, there's this it's called referred question 2B. And it goes back to the conversation I was having with Michael with regards to where do the homeless go and how do we put something up that would be humane for the homeless as we try to solve the issue for the homeless person. Tell us what the referendum 2B is, referred question 2B. Michael
Wait,
Field,
okay.
Sorry.
Oh, me?
Oh yeah, are you ready for that answer?
I'm not ready for that one. So I was going to kick it to the other Michael for it.
Well, I've got here that you know the answer to that. So Michael, Garlic, can you bail him out?
Would you give us a summary, Earl?
Well, I can, as a matter of fact, so I'll answer my own question. It has to do with taking some of the money out of the current bond issue that we have. The bond issue is 40-some billion dollars, if I remember correctly. I'll tell you exactly what it is in a second. And taking a small amount of that for homeless shelters, with the idea being very simply that, hey, if we're going to, in essence, ask them not to, it's a $450 million bond package. And we're asking that 37.4 million be used to improve facilities and create facilities for the homeless.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the request is. So if we're going to pass one, that was ordinance 304 that we talked about. Well, let's make certain we have some place for these folks to go. And that would take about 37.4 billion, and it would be a little less than 10% of what we're talking about in the current bond offering to provide sanitary conditions for folks that are homeless. Doesn't answer the question about somebody camping on the parking lot and somebody trying to sue them, but it says, hey, if you're there, and let's make certain that you have a chance to be someplace that is really sanitary and we're not going to, in essence, spread disease or things like that.
Right, it does help with the supply issue. And you mentioned how the statewide ballot doesn't have many measures this year. I believe there are 13 total for Denver. And a lot of those are referred measures dealing with bonds. So $190 million for a national Western Center arena, improvements to transportation, homelessness funding. So it's a big package and it doesn't come around that often, but the council did approve it. The only contentious piece was that National Western Center arena. The people in the community, the neighboring areas that have been affected by the construction, the poor air quality, and those are historically, poorer and communities of color. They asked why we need hundreds of millions of dollars put into this when we could be helping out those communities. And I guess voters have the chance to answer that question of why should we put that money toward the national.
That's with regards to the bonds.
The bonds, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, questions from you all. I'm sure that we probably have answered as thoroughly some issues as you'd like. So do we have questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am. Who ran it? Well, I know a little bit about that. You have an issue where there's a group of people saying that there tends to be, well, you asked the question who ran it. It would be a couple of different organizations that have a bipartisan support. I can't name people's names, but it's a couple of bipartisan groups. Pardon? I can't remember their names. All I know is they're bipartisan. Yeah, sir, you had a question. That's, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm gonna, Kelly, can I get?
Oh, I will. Okay, go ahead, please. Any other questions? Sir?
So we were, I'm seeing trouble with the Denver Metro building. We, excuse me, we're discussing the homeless challenge on the ballot. One of the concerns we had that.
Are you going to repeat it? One of the good
Is
challenges.
that there's currently the district judge says that they have to get the 7-day notice, but I think in the ballot actually says 72 hours, but they have to be out, so there's like this conflict. Is there, does anybody understand how that can be resolved?
I have none. The question is, there's a 72-hour requirement on the ballot to vacate your homelessness situation, where a judge has ruled that it's a 7-day window to vacate, and there's a conflict with regards to that, and how will that be resolved? I have no idea. Anybody up here?
It would be challenged.
Well, that's the obvious answer. Okay. We'll have to go to court. I got you. Okay.
I can, without speaking to the law as it exists now or what he was using to determine that 7-day notice period, you're right that the judge, whoever it is, will have to reconcile those two competing provisions of the law. And I guess the judge could decide that 72 hours prevails over 7 days, or maybe 7 days prevails over 72 hours, or the council could step in beforehand and on its own reconcile those two competing provisions. So if it is a conflict, then someone's going to have to resolve it.
Michael, you do a pretty good job for not being an attorney.
Thank you. It is.
That is. One more question? Yes, please.
So in a way, there is going to be a conflict board program. And I not be implementation.
Tony, that's your wheelhouse, buddy.
Yeah, you have to rephrase the question for the audience.
Okay, the question is, there's an unelected board of 9 people that will be appointed to the, appointed to a commission that will oversee the LEAP program at the state level. And that board has a term with regards to it. There's a turnover, and the governor is in control of the folks that will be appointed to that board. And the concern is, wait a minute, it seems that they will be supported by LEAP. Tony, is that how you see it?
No, I don't. The board is appointed by the governor. There are 9 board members. Those board members serve an initial term of 3 years. As they start the term out and they stagger the terms, that board provides a list of 3 candidates per seat that they would recommend to the governor to appoint. Plus, any public person can also apply. That governor, whoever that is, then selects from those 3 candidates per list, per seat, and the general public, whoever applies. So it's not a self-perpetuating board. It requires gubernatorial appointments and Senate confirmation. And they do approve providers. Right now, the provider qualifications are very basic. You have to have a business in Colorado. You have to have liability insurance, and you need to be background checked if you work with kids. So they don't decide curriculum up to providers. They approve providers so that there's a qualified pool. In addition, there's also a provider advisory council to the board made up of a wide variety of providers that help inform that board about quality programs and quality services. So I feel good about how that moves forward, because if you've been on a board, and most of you people are on boards, to have somebody randomly appointed to a board by the governor isn't super helpful sometimes. It's really helpful if you know people that can help you maintain the critical mass and energy of what you're doing. And the governor has ultimate decision authority along with Senate confirmation.
My biggest concern is that the choice of the vendor that's being chosen, that money doesn't really allow the individual who's receiving that money to make their own choice. They only can choose from the approved vendor list. Is that correct?
So a recipient of the money can choose a qualified provider, correct? Because this is state money, we have to have some controls over who are providers and right, auditing and make sure that these are good services, treating kids well and doing a good job.
So I guess I'm saying, you trust the parent only so far, right? Trust the parent make a choice that's only. And so if we put all this at the beginning of a voucher system, that's okay. And in reality, it is sort of, but it isn't, because ultimately that parent doesn't get to. They really want, they would reach from the provider.
It seems to me, Tony, we may have an issue of the perfect being the enemy of the
Correct,
good.
that's exactly
And
correct.
So, there is obviously not perfection here, but, there's a step towards something that you're trying to solve. Brenda, you know a little bit about this, don't you?
Jack, I asked a question, so is it true though that the intent is to open us up to hundreds of providers and have as big of a robust of a marketplace up there?
It is.
Is it true that this is going to be open to hundreds of providers, so it could be as robust of a marketplace as possible?
And our belief is that it'll be thousands of providers across the state. The intent is to create as much choice as possible. It's not a voucher system in the classic K-12 sense because it cannot be used for school tuition. This is not a voucher program to choose a parochial school or a private school. It's out of school. This is schools and we think that's really important. It's not a guaranteed basic income. That's a whole different issue. This is about how do you help your kids learn in the out of school time. And we're trying to make it as robust and big and exciting a marketplace as possible.
Please come up and ask them anything you would like, but not me. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you to our panelists. We have a little token of appreciation for you all. You already have one. So before we turn to our next speaker, let's just give the panelists one more round of applause. They're all volunteers. Thanks for joining us this morning. So a lot of talk about homelessness. There's a few issues on the city and county of Denver ballot. For those of you who were with us in June, we gave a sneak peek to our study on homelessness that we released in August. It made some national news. It even made international headlines. And I'd like to invite the main author of the report, CSI Mike A. Luprino Fellow Brenda Dickhoner, to the stage to go over the key findings of that important. Prior to joining CSI, Brenda spent the last decade working in education policy at the national and state level. Most recently, however, Brenda was just named president and CEO of Ready Colorado, an organization that believes in the education system needs to focus on more attention on the needs of student families, less on the needs of the system itself. Schools, districts, and the state should be more accountable to parents and taxpayers. Congratulations on your new role, Brenda, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I think that was the, did you want to see that? This was the, sorry, I didn't know the slide was there. This is the Fox News clip that aired nationally. It's a video. I don't, okay. Do you want me to play the video? Oh, I didn't rehearse clearly, but thank you. Thank you for letting me talk a little bit about this. Our report on the economic analysis of homelessness in the Metro Denver area was a partnership with CU Denver's InWorks Innovation Lab, and they have been great thought partners, and you'll see more of their great work as we release the next phase. So this report the findings I'll talk about today are from this first phase of the economic analysis. We are also embarking on further research to understand the system dynamics and to understand more about those leverage points where we could potentially push on to get better outcomes. So look forward to sharing that work with you later at a later date. But today I'm going to talk about the economic analysis, which included statistics on generally the homelessness in the Metro Denver area, how many people and what types of people are experiencing homelessness. We looked at revenue and expenditure. We looked at the workforce surrounding it and the shelter and housing beds. So I'm going to go pretty briefly through this and welcome your questions afterwards of the presentation. The data on the number of individuals experiencing homelessness in Metro Denver comes from what we call a PIT count, which is a point in time count taken one night in January, where those individuals experiencing homelessness are counted, whether they are sheltered or unsheltered. The last full count took place in 2020, so in January 2020, before the pandemic, and found a little over 6,000 individuals experiencing homelessness. Of those, about half were in emergency shelters and a quarter unsheltered and a quarter in what's called transitional housing. The 2021 count was just conducted of those that were sheltered. They did not feel safe with COVID-19 count unsheltered populations. But what they found was that the number of individuals in shelters increased 40% during the pandemic. And so that number in this bucket in 2020 was around 2,900 in emergency shelters. And then in 2021, it was 4,000 individuals in emergency shelters throughout the Metro Denver area. So a substantial increase in that population. Talk very briefly about revenue streams for this ecosystem. It's a very complex source of funds that are intertwined. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development provides a good deal of funding to both states and municipalities and to what are called continuum of cares, which are agencies that organize providers in this space. Those funds also flow down to providers who are providing these direct services. And they also, those charitable organizations and providers receive other funds from philanthropies and other sources of taxpayer dollars, but there's local taxes, state taxes, and the federal funds kind of flowing into these providers. So rather than try to track these revenue streams, we wanted to report out expenditures from providers that were ensuring we're not double counting the amounts that we were trying to investigate to ultimately figure out how much is being spent on services related to homelessness. So we looked at over 48 charitable nonprofit services. We looked at their 990. Through that, I will jump to the headline, and then I'm going to backtrack and explain a little bit how we got there. We found $481 million being spent annually within the metro area, the 7-county metro area, and then $434 million being spent within the city of Denver. And one reason that share is so high is, so the city of Denver is home to 70% of the individuals experiencing homelessness. So it is a large share. There's also a bulk of services and shelters being provided within the city of Denver, which attracts individuals from surrounding counties into the city. So that might impact that count number too. And within our methodology, we looked at those charitable organizations providing services where their headquarters are. So many of them are headquartered in Denver, but are providing services in Aurora or Adams County, et cetera. So it is a large portion that you kind of see in this number for those, to give you those caveats. And break it down a little bit for you as well. So we looked at numbers specifically from Denver Health, which the hospital reports out the expenditures that it makes serving individuals experiencing homelessness each year. It's a report to the city. There are other hospitals in the area there are many other hospitals in the area serving individuals experiencing homelessness, but they don't provide this data. So this was really kind of our one snapshot at looking at the healthcare side of the expenditures. We also reached out to various departments and agencies within Denver. So the Denver Police and Fire Department numbers are those expenditures that are their staff who are directly and specifically working with individuals experiencing homelessness. And so these aren't contracts out to providers. So again, we're not trying to double count, but rather these were the direct expenses by the fire and police departments in their work to serve this population. The Homelessness Resolution Fund was a tax that was passed just last year. And so that had not, when we were looking at those tax forms and annual reports for the charitable organizations providers, those tax dollars hadn't been spent yet. So we, again, are not double counting that. And but that will be an ongoing annual expenditure that we felt was important to reflect the overall taxpayer investment. And if you were to redo this report in future years, eventually, those funds are going to flow to those providers and would be in that kind of bottom line item of charitable organizations, which is around $217 million. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly through, we did a snapshot of Boulder and Aurora as well. And so Boulder has an estimated budget from their city that again is their direct expenditures through things like ambassadors and park rangers and police officers. They actually just voted to increase the number of park rangers and police officers serving individuals experiencing homelessness. And then about 14 million from charitable organizations in Boulder. City of Aurora got us information as well from their departments. These are their best estimates of this data. They don't specifically track this information, but for their best estimate from their city manager was that their police and fire departments spend a little bit under $1 million. And then another, almost 900,000 from their housing and community services department on direct expenditures, so not contracts out to providers. The organizations within Aurora specifically that are pretty focused on City of Aurora is around $6 million from those charitable organizations being spent. Altogether, then there was some other organizations in other cities that weren't included in those kind of three profiles. So that was about $23 million. And so altogether, that's how we reached our number of 481 million. And I kind of sound like a little bit of a broken record, but just want to again emphasize that we really spent months of time digging through different financial data to ensure that we were getting our best estimate and that we weren't double counting. We didn't include numbers we weren't certain about. So things like Denver Housing Authority, which we know a certain percentage of those housing vouchers serve chronically homeless individuals. Some of them also serve low-income individuals that are currently housed and struggling to retain housing. But I think we wanted to not include that number because we just weren't sure what that percentage was. One of our partners said it was around 30% for him, but he wasn't sure what other housing authorities percentage was. Caring for Denver, it's a tax that was passed within the city of Denver to support mental health. Certainly a portion of that is also going to individuals experiencing homelessness, but again, not sure about that number, so we didn't include it. And then we did not have a comprehensive look at all of the city agencies and departments. You saw what we did have around fire and police, and there were others around, within Denver itself, we didn't have their parks and recreation number, which they have park rangers dedicated to this as well. Overall, as a per person expenditure, we did a range looking at that point in time count that I mentioned at the beginning of the slideshow was one night in time. Another way to estimate the population experiencing homelessness is to think about how many individuals experience homelessness within a given year, once within a given year, because some stays or some experiences with homelessness can be short, can be just a couple weeks as you try to transition into new housing. So the way you look at it can differ in terms of how you want to think about the population experiencing homelessness. And so our range on the, you can kind of see the red is the annual count from what would be about 2.5 times the pit count. And that's an estimate that organizations use, like Colorado Coalition of the Homeless and Catholic Charities. When we talked to them, they recommended that multiplier. And so from that, you can see in the city of Denver that around $42,000 to $104,000 is being spent per person. Within the broader Metro Denver area, $31,000 to $78,000 being spent per person. And you look at the city of Denver number specifically, and then we included some other city of Denver expenses as well of what is spent, for example, per pupil within K-12 education. DPS actually has a pretty high per pupil spending rate compared to some other districts, around $19,000 per student. We know that average yearly rent is around $21,000 per person, or per an apartment. And then that per capita income is somewhere around $45,000 and median household income around $68,000. Within the report itself, this is really just a slide to remind me to tell you that within the report itself, you can find a spreadsheet of all of the charitable organizations we looked at and the data that we got from them and their expenses broken out, so we could be transparent about the information we included. This was not a comprehensive view. We know that there are charities that are missing from this list that are working in the space, that there's faith-based organizations, but this is a pretty comprehensive list in the sense that we got a lot of the bigger providers on here. One of the other things we looked at is the workforce surrounding homelessness. And this, again, we estimated as a range, given sort of the uncertainty on some of the numbers, with a lot of these organizations have other purposes that they are allocating FTE or kind of split between different programs. Which I will say, as we collected expenditures, we did just look at the programs that are being spent on homelessness. So like Mile High United Way, for example, we only used the portion of their budget on their homelessness program. And then the number of volunteers, so we looked at the number of employees, around 4,000 to 7,000 was our estimate. And then we looked at the number of volunteers, this is a very large volunteer sector. The sector relies heavily on volunteers to help provide these services. And this is will be an interesting linkage for our next phase of research, as we will show some of the challenges that come with being kind of a volunteer model or based provider and relying heavily on volunteers, and opportunities for potentially to think differently about how kind of some of that is structured, or ways to better train and retain volunteers. But that's coming. I'm just giving you a teaser for, there's more good stuff coming. And I think the important thing too to note is that there's a financial value to volunteer hours. This estimate is taken from the national average of the value of volunteer time. Okay, and lastly, just very briefly, just wanted to show that the shelter bed and housing capacity right now, and this is from the city of Denver data. This slide is Metro Denver, the next one's City of Denver. This is Metro Denver, that shows that there is generally beds available on a night-to-night basis in both transitional housing and emergency shelters, about 72% to 82% or 88% occupied, depending on severe weather shelter beds. And then this is specifically within the city of Denver throughout the pandemic. So this starts in January 2020 and goes through January 2021. And this is important because the city of Denver provided this data, and it's available on their website, and they report this out publicly. And this allows, if there are shelter beds available, then they are allowed to enforce the kind of encampment bans when if there are beds. If there aren't beds available, then they can't enforce that ban. Next steps, I've alluded a lot to our kind of coming research. We're really excited about the systems mapping work that the University of Colorado is doing and helping us out with, and that we are going to be providing a website to go along with that will be interactive. And so we ask that you kind of stay tuned. And I'm also happy to answer any questions at this time. Yes. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. This gentleman has mentioned that he's been regularly volunteering. Thank you so much for that volunteer service in homelessness shelters. And and then asked, with this kind of growing population and growing level of expenditures, why aren't we moving the needle, and what could be done? And it's a great question, and that is why we started out on this project to begin with. And this first phase was to really understand the resources within the system. And then the second phase is to understand more about specifically what are the challenges within the ecosystem and how can we move forward, identify those, what we're calling opportunity areas where we can improve or strengthen or double down on positive things that are working. But I think that, so I'm excited to be able to share those results with you this fall. I think that the one observation that was made, at least on my part in doing this, is the kind of lack of coordination and leadership in this area. And it is a very complex situation. Not everyone experiencing homelessness has a different background and a different story and a different kind of cause for how they've gotten into where they are. And so it's a very complex human problem. And then you layer on that a kind of very siloed and patchwork system of serving these individuals. And that came out from interviews with providers themselves saying that, we feel really disconnected from other providers and we don't know who's really helping kind of see that systems level view of this to coordinate services. And so again, some of those kind of recommendations for next steps will come out in our second phase and will be somewhat around that need for coordination within the sector. Yes. So the question was around observations from Mayor Kaufman's experience when he went to be homeless. I don't know how to explain his experience, or he was, but his observation was that there was a certain segment of the population that was choosing not to go into these shelter beds because of their substance use and abuse problems. And I think one observation was from this work that I was working on is that there is there seems to be it's not as prevalent of a conversation to have to talk about how we are also addressing these root causes around substance abuse or mental health, and that there seems to be a kind of triage approach where we are focusing on how do we get more beds and get more shelter beds and get more housing. And that's important. That's one side of the equation. But then the other side of the equation is how are we also dedicating resources to those individuals that have these concerns. And I think, there is, even again, talking with providers, there are same reflections on that of, there is a real issue if you have an addiction and you can't get stable housing because there are very specific rules, particularly when you look at some of the federal HUD dollar programs around being able to have this housing opportunity, and not being able to or to take drugs into your housing opportunity. And so with this kind of disconnect, what are the solutions and how are we dedicating resources to that specific problem? But I think we need to also be talking about it more. Again, this is just my personal observation of doing this research, was that it just wasn't, people are very reticent to talk about it, and that it seems like we know it is an issue for certain, it just, it is, again, a segment of the population. So it's not the entire spectrum, but it is an issue. And so it is, how do we talk about it? And one of the cases, so again, a plug for the next phase, we did these many kind of case studies based on programs that are seeing success. And one of them has kind of an innovative approach to thinking about how to resolve kind of those disconnects. So yes, one more question. Thank you for deferring. Yes, Steve, please. Yeah. Thank you. I think that was a good recommendation to look into a program that potentially was this the social impact bond program? Do you know, was this the social impact bond program? Potentially, we'll look into it and see if we can include this in our second phase of research. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for being here this morning.
And with that, it's a wrap. Thank you all for joining us in person, for being here today. There are ballot guides on the table. For those of you virtual, please download our free ballot guide. And I look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you.